The chill that settled in my bones wasn't from the autumn air, but from the cold, hard data staring back at me from the illuminated screen of his discarded tablet. A rogue notification, a fragment of a conversation, had snagged my eye, a digital whisper that shattered the carefully constructed world I had inhabited for the past 5 years. It wasn't a smoking gun, not yet, but it was the first hairline fracture in the facade of our perfect life, a life he had so meticulously curated for my consumption while secretly living another. My breath caught, a sharp, painful gasp that I quickly muffled, my hand flying to my mouth as if to trap the sound, to keep the fragile piece from shattering aloud. He was in the shower, the rhythmic drumming of water against tile a cruel counterpoint to the frantic beating of my own heart. For weeks, a gnawing unease had been a constant companion, a subtle disharmony in the symphony of our routine. Little things, his phone, once a shared amusement, now guarded with an almost religious fervor. The vague excuses for late nights that grew increasingly threadbare. The way his eyes would flicker away when I asked about his day, a micro-expression of guilt I hadn't recognized until now. He had always been so charming, so effortlessly charismatic, a master of deflection and subtle manipulation. He'd made me feel like I was the one being irrational, overthinking, too sensitive. "You worry too much, love," he'd say, pulling me into a hug that felt less comforting with each passing day, more like a cage. He'd paint my legitimate concerns as insecurities, a narrative he'd spun so effectively that I had begun to internalize it, questioning my own sanity, my own perceptions. The emotional toll had been immense, a slow erosion of my self-trust, leaving me feeling perpetually off-kilter, always striving to be less demanding, more understanding. But this pixelated glimpse into a secret life, was undeniable. It was a name I didn't recognize, attached to a flirty, intimate message that spoke volumes beyond its few words. My initial reaction was a sickening lurch, a hot wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. Then, a profound, gut-wrenching grief. It wasn't just the betrayal of infidelity. It was the betrayal of every shared laugh, every whispered promise, every future dream we had meticulously built together. He had been so convincing, so adept at playing the role of the devoted partner, that the depth of his deception felt like a physical blow. My hands trembled as I carefully placed the tablet back exactly where I'd found it, ensuring no trace of my intrusion remained. I moved with a phantom grace, my body feeling disconnected, a mere vessel for the storm raging within. The next few days were a blur of simulated normalcy. I smiled, I nodded, I cooked his favorite meals, all while a silent, furious calculation took root in the deepest recesses of my mind. The pain was still there, a raw, gaping wound, but something else was beginning to stir beneath it, a cold, hard resolve. The victimhood he had so skillfully imposed upon me was beginning to crack, replaced by a steely determination. I realized then that merely confronting him, merely walking away, would not suffice. It would grant him the easy out, the opportunity to spin his narrative, to make me the villain for discovering his transgressions. He would move on, unblemished, leaving me to pick up the pieces of my shattered trust and self-worth. That simply wasn't an option. No, I needed more than just an exit. I needed an understanding. I needed to know the full scope of his deceit, the intricate tapestry of lies he had woven around me. The first step was observation, meticulous and unseen. My eyes, once clouded by love and trust, now became clinical instruments. I began to watch him with the dispassionate gaze of a scientist studying a specimen. I noted his patterns, the precise times he left for work meetings that stretched into the night, the subtle changes in his wardrobe, the way he'd suddenly become an expert in a new hobby I'd never heard him mention before. I started paying attention to the way he held his phone, the angle of his screen, the fleeting expressions that crossed his face when a certain notification popped up. I learned to read the subtle shifts in his voice, the almost imperceptible hesitation before a lie, the way his eyes would dart to the side. I began to gather information, not just emotionally, but physically. His routine was my map. His digital footprint, a treasure trove. I started with the obvious, checking his social media for any new connections, any unusual activity. Then, more subtly, I began to note down the names he mentioned, the places he frequented, cross-referencing them against public records, even casual mentions in conversations with mutual friends. I became a ghost in our own home, moving silently, listening intently, piecing together the fragmented puzzle of his double life. The pain was still a constant throb, but it was now a focused energy, a fuel for the engine of my burgeoning plan. The tears I cried were no longer just of sorrow, but of a fierce, silent rage, a promise to myself that I would not just survive this betrayal, I would transform it into my ultimate triumph. The game had begun, and he didn't even know he was playing. The initial shock had given way to a chilling clarity, an almost surgical precision in my thinking. The raw pain was still a deep ache in my chest, a constant reminder of the trust he had so carelessly shredded, but it no longer paralyzed me. Instead, it sharpened my focus, honing my senses to an almost superhuman degree. Every interaction with him became a data point, every casual conversation a potential source of intelligence. I observed him with a detached curiosity, as if he were a specimen under a microscope, his predictable routines and subtle tells revealing themselves with startling clarity. He was, in his own arrogant way, remarkably transparent to an observer who knew what to look for. My first objective was to confirm the extent of his deceit. The tablet notification was a whisper. I needed a shout. I knew his password, a simple one he'd used for years, a testament to his belief in my unquestioning loyalty. It felt like a violation to use it, a transgression against the very intimacy we were supposed to share, but the greater violation had already been committed by him. One night, while he was engrossed in a late-night gaming session, another excuse for his prolonged absences, I waited. The rhythmic click of his mouse, the low murmur of his headset, became the soundtrack to my quiet reconnaissance. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the silence of the room, but my hands were steady as I picked up his phone. The sheer volume of evidence was staggering. It wasn't just one person. It was a string of casual flings, a digital paper trail of infidelity stretching back months, possibly even years. There were the explicit messages, the suggestive photos, the carefully crafted alibis for his work trips and late meetings that were, in reality, trysts with various women. The betrayal was so much deeper, so much more pervasive than I had initially imagined. A cold fury began to simmer beneath my skin, hardening the resolve that was already taking root. It wasn't just about getting even. It was about reclaiming the pieces of myself he had tried to obliterate, about dismantling the facade he had so cruelly maintained. The emotional impact was profound. It wasn't just a single knife twist, it was 1,000 tiny cuts, each one revealing another layer of his duplicity. The memories of our shared past, once cherished and comforting, now felt tainted, poisoned by the knowledge of his constant deceit. Every "I love you" he had uttered, every intimate moment we had shared, now felt like a performance, a carefully orchestrated lie. I felt a profound sense of humiliation, not just for being betrayed, but for being so thoroughly, so completely fooled. The anger was a burning inferno, but it was a controlled burn, fueling my determination rather than consuming me. I shed tears, yes, but they were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of righteous indignation, a silent promise to myself that he would pay for every single one. My planning began in earnest. This wouldn't be a messy confrontation, a tearful accusation that he could easily dismiss or twist. This would be a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a slow, methodical unraveling of his carefully constructed reality. I needed to gather irrefutable proof, not just for my own satisfaction, but for the devastating impact it would have on him. I started with the basics: screenshots. Hundreds of them. Texts, dating app profiles, social media conversations, even location data from shared apps I'd conveniently forgotten to disable on his phone. I created a hidden folder on a cloud drive, encrypted and password protected, a digital vault for his sins. Each screenshot was a brick in the wall of his impending downfall. I also delved into the more subtle aspects of his life. His daily routine, once an irritating predictability, now became a key to his vulnerabilities. I noted the times he left for his gym sessions, which often coincided with early morning texts from one of his conquests. I observed his meticulous grooming habits, the new cologne he started wearing, the sudden interest in obscure bars and restaurants he claimed to have discovered with colleagues. I even started tracking his car, using a discreet GPS tracker I purchased online, disguised as a common household item and tucked away in an obscure corner of his vehicle. It felt illicit, invasive, but the feeling of being violated by his betrayal far outweighed any moral qualms I might have had. The planning extended beyond just gathering evidence. I began to think about the psychological impact of what I was going to do. My goal wasn't just to expose him, it was to make him feel the consequences of his actions, to experience a fraction of the confusion, the paranoia, the loss of control that he had inflicted upon me. I researched psychological principles, the effects of gaslighting, the power of subtle suggestion. I wanted to turn his own manipulative tactics against him, to make him question his own sanity, to feel the ground shift beneath his feet. This wasn't just revenge, it was a carefully orchestrated performance, and I was the director, the playwright, and the lead actress. I started to subtly alter my own behavior, just enough to be noticeable to a keen observer, but not enough to arouse his suspicion. I would occasionally forget my phone at home, knowing he would casually check it, leaving a breadcrumb trail of innocuous, yet subtly misleading, information. I would hum a new song, a song he wouldn't recognize, that I knew one of his conquests had mentioned. I would leave a single, unfamiliar earring on the bedside table, as if accidentally dropped. These were tiny, almost imperceptible shifts, designed to plant seeds of doubt, to make him wonder if his own carefully constructed world was as solid as he believed. The quiet suffering was transforming into a quiet strength, a dark determination that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The silence in our home, once filled with the unspoken tension of my pain, was now charged with the hum of my meticulous planning. He was living in a glass house, and I was slowly, deliberately, gathering the stones. The meticulous gathering of evidence escalated from digital forensics to physical reconnaissance. My apartment, once a sanctuary of shared intimacy, transformed into a clandestine operations center. Maps of the city were spread across my desk, marked with the locations of his known liaisons, the work trip hotels, the gyms that were conveniently near his other women's residences. I became a master of observation, a silent shadow in his periphery. I knew his schedule better than he did, the precise moments he'd leave the house, the routes he'd take, the exact duration of his meetings. Every detail was a piece of the puzzle, every inconsistency a new lead. I invested in discreet surveillance equipment, a high-definition dashcam for my car, set to record continuously, capturing not just his movements but also the women he met. I bought a tiny, almost invisible voice recorder, which I would occasionally accidentally leave running in the living room or his study, hoping to catch a stray phone call or a whispered conversation. The ethical implications were a distant hum, drowned out by the righteous roar of my betrayal. He had stripped me of my dignity, my trust, and my peace of mind. What I was doing was merely an attempt to reclaim a fraction of what he had stolen. The emotional detachment I cultivated was a necessary shield. To truly execute my plan, I couldn't afford to be consumed by the rage or the sorrow. I had to be cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. Each new piece of evidence, instead of plunging me deeper into despair, fueled a grim satisfaction. It was like assembling a complex machine, each gear and lever perfectly placed, designed for a single, devastating purpose. I found myself sleeping less, my mind buzzing with strategies, contingencies, and the sheer delight of envisioning his eventual downfall. One particularly damning piece of evidence emerged from his business trips. He always claimed to be staying in generic chain hotels, but a quick cross-reference with his credit card statements, which I had access to, thanks to our shared accounts, revealed a pattern of bookings at boutique hotels, often with spa services or romantic packages, in cities where he had no known business associates. A quick search of the hotel names often revealed their reputation as romantic getaways, not business hubs. Armed with this information, I cross-referenced the dates with his phone records, noting the frequent calls to certain numbers during those periods. It wasn't just a casual fling, he was investing time and money, creating a parallel life of romantic escapades. The psychological component of my plan began to take shape. I wanted him to feel the same disorienting paranoia he had inflicted on me. He had gaslighted me into questioning my own perceptions, my own sanity. Now, it was his turn. My revenge wouldn't be a sudden, explosive confrontation. It would be a slow, insidious creep, a subtle dismantling of his reality, designed to make him believe he was losing his mind. I started by planting tiny, almost imperceptible seeds of doubt. I began to subtly alter his environment. A book he swore he'd left on his bedside table would mysteriously appear on the coffee table. His keys, always in their designated bowl, would sometimes be found in a different pocket of his coat. These were minor shifts, easily dismissed as his own forgetfulness, but I was counting on the cumulative effect. I would carefully move a small decorative item in the living room, just a few inches, enough to be subconsciously registered but not consciously noticed. The goal was to create a subtle sense of unease, a feeling that things weren't quite right, that his environment was subtly shifting around him. I also started to subtly manipulate his digital world. I knew his email password, and on rare occasions, when he was out, I would log in and mark certain emails he was expecting from work as read without opening them, or move them to a different folder. Then, a day or two later, he'd frantically search for them, only to find them where I'd placed them, making him question his own memory. "I could have sworn I hadn't read that," he'd mutter, a furrow appearing between his brows. I'd offer a sympathetic shrug. "You've been so busy lately, maybe you just forgot." My feigned concern was a dagger in his back. The most satisfying part of this preliminary phase was observing his reactions. He started to become agitated, subtly at first. He'd spend more time searching for misplaced items, his brow furrowed in concentration. He'd occasionally snap at me, a rare occurrence, then immediately apologize, attributing his irritability to stress at work. He was already beginning to feel the first tremors of the earthquake I was about to unleash, and he had no idea why. The quiet suffering I had endured was transforming into a quiet power, a potent force that was slowly, meticulously, tightening its grip around his carefully constructed world. This was just the beginning. The foundation of his reality was cracking, and I was the architect of its demolition. The subtle environmental manipulations were yielding precisely the results I had anticipated. He was becoming noticeably more irritable, his usual unflappable demeanor fraying at the edges. Small, everyday occurrences that he once dismissed with a shrug now caused him to pause, to look around with a nascent suspicion in his eyes. The misplaced keys, the moved book, the read emails, each incident, innocuous on its own, was a tiny grain of sand in the gears of his meticulously ordered world. He'd rub his temples, sigh deeply, and blame it on fatigue or a heavy workload. I would nod sympathetically, offering a comforting word, all the while savoring the internal triumph. My performance was flawless, my mask of concern impenetrable. My surveillance continued, growing ever more sophisticated. I had discovered that he used a specific, obscure brand of cologne when meeting his various paramours, a scent he never wore around me. It was a subtle detail, but one that spoke volumes about his compartmentalization. I also noticed a pattern in his late nights. They almost always coincided with specific events in the city, a new art exhibit opening, a concert at a smaller venue, or even a particular restaurant's themed night. These weren't random hookups. He was taking these women on dates, investing time and effort into their deception. This elevated my anger from mere betrayal to a profound sense of insult. He wasn't just cheating, he was building parallel romantic lives, using my trust as his foundation. The psychological warfare intensified. My next step was to introduce auditory elements, subtle cues designed to make him question his own hearing. I started playing very low volume, almost subliminal sounds when he was in another room, or just drifting off to sleep. I'd use a white noise machine, barely audible, but with a faint, almost imperceptible whisper of a specific female name, one I'd found in his texts. Or sometimes, the faint, distant sound of a specific song that one of his other women had mentioned. I'd use an app on my phone, setting the volume to an absolute minimum, just enough to register on the edge of conscious perception. When he'd stir, I'd quickly turn it off, feigning sleep. "Did you hear that?" He'd sometimes mumble, half asleep. "Hear what, honey?" I'd reply, my voice thick with feigned sleepiness. "Nothing, must have been dreaming," he'd dismiss, pulling the covers closer. But the seed was planted. He was beginning to doubt his own senses. The beauty of this tactic was its deniability. How could he possibly accuse me of playing sounds he could barely hear? It was all in his head, a product of his own stressed mind. This was the insidious nature of gaslighting, turning a person against their own perceptions, making them believe they are losing their grip on reality. I was mirroring his own tactics back at him, amplifying them, and turning them into a weapon. I also started to subtly manipulate his perception of time. I would occasionally, very subtly, change the settings on the household clocks, just a minute or two forward or backward. Nothing drastic enough to cause real problems, but enough to create a nagging sense of temporal disorientation. He would look at his watch, then at the oven clock, then at his phone, a puzzled expression on his face. "Are these clocks all off?" he'd mumble. "No, seems fine to me," I'd reply, perfectly innocent. This constant, subtle dissonance was designed to erode his confidence in his own internal clock, a fundamental aspect of his daily routine. The emotional impact on me during this phase was complex. There were moments of profound satisfaction, a grim pleasure in watching him squirm, to see the cracks forming in his smug veneer. But there were also moments of deep sadness, a quiet grief for the person I thought he was, for the life we were supposed to have. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred at times, but I always pulled myself back, reminding myself of the immense emotional and psychological damage he had inflicted. My actions, I rationalized, were a necessary act of self-preservation, a reclamation of my own narrative. He began to exhibit signs of growing paranoia. He started checking his phone more frequently, not just for messages, but almost as if he expected it to disappear. He'd double-check locked doors, even though he never had before. He'd occasionally glance over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be there. He was becoming wary, unsettled, and increasingly isolated in his own mind. His casual charm, once so effortless, now felt strained, brittle. He was losing his composure, slowly but surely. My meticulous planning extended to creating a subtle alibi for myself, should he ever become truly suspicious. I started taking up a new hobby, something that required me to be out of the house at specific, regular intervals. A pottery class, for instance, twice a week. This not only gave me legitimate reasons to be absent during certain hours when I might be conducting my surveillance, but it also provided a plausible explanation for my own subtle shifts in routine. I was building my own parallel life, not of deceit, but of strategic preparation. The atmosphere in our home, once suffocating with my unspoken pain, was now charged with a different kind of tension. It was the hum of an unseen, intricate mechanism, ticking steadily towards its inevitable conclusion. He was walking through a maze of my own design, and every turn, every dead end, was leading him precisely where I wanted him to go. He still had no idea he was caught in a carefully constructed web, and that was my ultimate weapon. His unraveling was progressing exactly as planned. The psychological pressure mounted, and I observed his reactions with a chilling detachment that surprised even myself. He was visibly fraying, his once confident posture now often slumping, his eyes darting around with an almost hunted look. The subtle auditory cues, the temporal shifts, the displaced objects, they were all working in concert, chipping away at his sense of reality. He'd frequently ask me if I'd moved something, or if I'd heard a strange noise, his voice edged with a new tremor of uncertainty. My consistent, calm denials, delivered with just the right amount of loving concern, only served to deepen his self-doubt. "Are you sure you're getting enough sleep, honey? You seem a little on edge lately," I'd murmur, the words a poisoned balm. My surveillance had evolved beyond mere observation. I started creating scenarios to test his reactions, to push him further into the abyss of his own paranoia. I knew he had a particular mistress he met at a coffee shop downtown, a place he frequented on Tuesday mornings. One Monday night, I accidentally left a small, inexpensive item, a pen, a hair tie, in his car, specifically in the passenger footwell. The next morning, when he returned from his supposed early meeting, I retrieved the item, seemingly oblivious. A few hours later, I would casually remark, "Oh, I found my pen in your car, how strange. Did you pick me up after work last week and I just forgot?" He'd stammer, his eyes wide with a fleeting panic. "No, I don't think so. Must have just rolled under the seat." He was grasping for explanations, trying to rationalize the inexplicable. The beauty of this tactic lay in its ambiguity. I wasn't directly accusing him, I was simply presenting an anomaly that his cheating mind would interpret through the lens of his guilt. He wouldn't suspect me of planting it, he would suspect his other women, or worse, That they were somehow leaving traces in his car, inadvertently exposing him. The seeds of suspicion between him and his conquests were now being sown, a delicious added layer to my scheme. I also began to leave subtle, almost invisible, traces of others in our home. I'd buy a new, generic brand of shampoo, use it once, then pour it down the drain, leaving the faint scent in the bathroom for him to notice. "Did you try a new shampoo?" he'd ask, sniffing the air. "No, same old," I'd reply, perfectly innocent. Or I'd purchase a cheap, brightly colored hair clip, leave it on the bathroom counter for an hour, then discreetly dispose of it. These were not direct accusations, but rather subtle suggestions of another presence, just enough to make him wonder, to make him feel watched, even in his own home. The emotional toll on me was surprisingly minimal during these active stages. The initial heartbreak had calcified into a hard, cold resolve. Each successful manipulation, each flicker of panic in his eyes, was a small victory, a step closer to the catharsis I craved. The anger was still there, a simmering undercurrent, but it was now a controlled energy, channeled into the meticulous execution of my plan. I felt a strange sense of empowerment, a reclamation of agency that had been stripped away by his betrayal. I was no longer the passive victim, I was the architect of his demise. He started becoming increasingly jumpy, his phone practically glued to his hand, checking it compulsively, even during meals. He'd clear his browsing history with an almost obsessive frequency, a clear sign of his growing paranoia. He even started locking his study door, something he'd never done before, as if he expected me, or someone, to go through his things. This was a clear indication that my subtle manipulations were working. He was feeling exposed, vulnerable, and deeply unsettled. The next phase involved escalating the directness of the clues, while still maintaining plausible deniability. I started leaving anonymous notes in his car, typed on an old typewriter I bought specifically for this purpose, using generic paper and envelopes. The notes were vague, cryptic, hinting at knowledge of his infidelity without outright stating it. "She knows," one might say. Or, TikTok. Another might simply be a single, printed address, one of the addresses of his mistresses. I would slip these notes into the glove compartment, or under his seat, knowing he would eventually discover them. The effect was immediate and dramatic. He found the first note after a late night out. When he came home, he was pale, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. He frantically searched the car, then the house, muttering to himself. "What is this? Who would do this?" he whispered, running a hand through his hair. I pretended to be asleep, listening intently to his frantic movements. The satisfaction was exquisite. He was no longer dismissing things as his own forgetfulness. He was actively searching for an external threat, a shadow that wasn't there. He began to question me, not directly about his cheating, but about strange occurrences. "Have you noticed anything weird around the house lately?" he'd ask, trying to sound casual, but his eyes betrayed his anxiety. "Like what, honey?" I'd reply, feigning innocence, my voice calm and steady. "Oh, nothing, just... I don't know, things feel a little off." He was feeling the walls close in, and he couldn't pinpoint the source. The stage was set for the grand finale. His carefully constructed life was teetering on the brink of collapse, and I was ready to deliver the final push. The anonymous notes had been the tipping point. His casual anxieties transformed into full-blown paranoia. He was visibly jumpy, his gaze constantly scanning his surroundings, as if expecting a hidden camera or a lurking shadow. The once charming smile was replaced by a perpetual frown, his brow furrowed with a mixture of confusion and fear. He stopped meeting his mistresses as frequently, his fear of exposure outweighing his desire for illicit encounters. This was a clear sign that my psychological warfare was having its intended effect. He was retreating, isolating himself, consumed by the fear of an unseen threat. I escalated the notes, making them slightly more specific, but still vague enough to maintain plausible deniability. One note, left on his pillow, read, "Red dress, Tuesday." This was a direct reference to an outfit one of his mistresses had worn during a recent rendezvous, a detail I had gleaned from a photo on his phone. Another note, tucked into his wallet, simply stated, "The coffee shop knows." This was a subtle jab at his favorite meeting spot, designed to make him question everyone, even the unassuming baristas. He started checking his wallet obsessively, emptying it out multiple times a day, as if searching for hidden messages. His sleep became erratic. I'd often hear him pacing late at night, or muttering to himself in his sleep. He'd wake up with a start, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide and unfocused. He started losing weight, his appetite diminished by the constant gnawing anxiety. He would occasionally accuse me, indirectly, of knowing something, but I would always meet his veiled accusations with unwavering innocence and concern. "Honey, you're really scaring me," I'd say, my voice laced with feigned worry. "What's going on? Are you having trouble at work?" My performance was so convincing that he would often back down, convinced that his paranoia was indeed a sign of mental fatigue or stress. The emotional arc for me was reaching its zenith. The initial grief had long since evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp satisfaction. There was a sense of profound justice in watching him squirm, to see him experience a fraction of the emotional turmoil he had so carelessly inflicted upon me. The catharsis was building, a slow, exhilarating crescendo. I felt powerful, in control, a stark contrast to the helpless, gaslighted woman I had been just weeks prior. I knew the time was right to introduce the next layer of complexity, making him believe he was being actively followed. This required careful planning and a touch of theatricality. I enlisted the help of a trusted friend, Sarah, who lived in a different part of the city and had no connection to our mutual circle. I explained the situation to her in broad strokes, emphasizing his infidelity and my need for justice, omitting the more extreme details of my psychological warfare. Sarah, a fiercely loyal and pragmatic woman, agreed to help. Our plan was simple yet effective. Sarah would coincidentally appear in places he frequented, always at a distance, always out of his immediate line of sight. If he was at his gym, she'd be in the parking lot, seemingly engrossed in her phone. If he was at his local grocery store, she'd be in a different aisle, perhaps glancing his way for a fleeting second before looking away. She would never approach him, never make direct eye contact, just enough to register as a recurring, unsettling presence. The first time this happened, he came home visibly shaken. "I swear," he said, his voice a low growl, "I keep seeing the same car, the same woman, everywhere I go. It's like she's following me." I met his gaze with a calm, steady look. "Are you sure, love? Maybe it's just a coincidence. This city is small, you see the same people all the time." My words were designed to sow further doubt, to make him question his own perceptions even as he voiced them. The sightings became more frequent, more specific. Sarah would occasionally wear a distinctive item of clothing, a bright scarf, a unique hat, to ensure he registered her presence. She'd be at the gas station he used, at the dry cleaner, even in the parking lot of his workplace. Each time he saw her, he became more agitated, more convinced that he was under surveillance. He started changing his routes, driving evasively, checking his rearview mirror constantly. The fear was palpable. He began to talk about it openly, muttering about being watched or followed to anyone who would listen, including mutual friends. They, of course, would dismiss it as stress, as paranoia, reinforcing his belief that he was losing his mind. This was precisely what I wanted. His isolation was deepening, his support network eroding as he sounded increasingly unhinged. The emotional satisfaction I felt watching him descend into this self-made hell was immense. It wasn't just revenge, it was a profound act of reclaiming my narrative, of turning the tables on a man who had systematically undermined my reality. He had wanted me to feel crazy. Now he was experiencing it firsthand. The culmination of my efforts was drawing near, and the anticipation was a potent, intoxicating force. He was teetering on the edge, and I was ready to deliver the final, decisive push. The stalker narrative had taken root deeply in his psyche, blossoming into a full-blown obsession. He was no longer just jumpy. He was genuinely terrified. His once smooth confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a constant, twitchy vigilance. He started closing blinds the moment he got home, checking under his car before driving, and even installing a cheap, motion-activated camera by our front door, which, of course, never captured anything useful because Sarah was too smart for such amateur surveillance. His world was shrinking, consumed by the shadow of an unseen pursuer. I continued my role as the supportive, concerned partner, offering him calming teas, suggesting he talk to someone about his stress, subtly reinforcing the idea that his mental state was the root of his problems. "Maybe you should see a therapist, honey," I'd suggest gently. "It sounds like you're really struggling with anxiety." The irony was a bitter, satisfying taste on my tongue. He was struggling, indeed, but not with anxiety in the way he imagined. The next phase of my plan was to personalize the stalking to his specific transgressions, making the perceived threat directly relevant to his cheating. This would push him over the edge, forcing him to confront the very actions he was trying to hide. I began by sending him anonymous, untraceable text messages, using a burner phone I'd purchased with cash and discarded after each use. These messages were short, unsettling, and contained details only someone intimately familiar with his illicit activities would know. The first message arrived late one night. "She knows about the red dress." He dropped his phone, his face draining of color. He picked it up, reread the message, then frantically deleted it, as if erasing the words would erase the knowledge. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes, but I was engrossed in a book, feigning utter obliviousness. Another message followed a few days later. "The boutique hotel in Scottsdale was a nice touch." This detail, specific to one of his business trips with a mistress, sent him into a visible spiral. He paced the house, muttering to himself, running his hands through his hair. He even called his business associate in a hushed, frantic tone, trying to ascertain if anyone else knew about his supposed trip. His paranoia was now directly connecting to his infidelity, a crucial step in my plan. The emotional impact on me during this period was a complex blend of exhilaration and a strange, almost clinical detachment. Watching him unravel was satisfying, a direct consequence of his actions. Yet, there was also a residual sadness for the man I thought I knew, the man I had loved. But that sadness was quickly overshadowed by the fierce determination to see this through, to achieve the ultimate catharsis. I was no longer just seeking revenge, I was seeking complete psychological victory. He became obsessed with finding the source of the messages. He changed his phone number, installed new security software, but the messages still found him. I had multiple burner phones, changing numbers frequently, always sending the messages from public Wi-Fi hotspots or from areas far from our home, making them untraceable. Each new message, each specific detail, chipped away at his composure, making him question not just his sanity, but the loyalty of everyone around him. He started suspecting his mistresses, believing one of them was trying to expose him. He even suspected his closest friends, wondering if they were in on some elaborate prank. The isolation I had meticulously cultivated was now complete. The climax of this phase involved a carefully orchestrated physical clue that would directly implicate his cheating. I knew he kept a secret stash of cash and a small, nondescript notebook in a locked drawer in his home office, a place he thought was impenetrable. This notebook contained names, dates, and even small expense notes related to his various affairs. I had discovered the hidden key to this drawer weeks ago, during my initial surveillance. One afternoon, while he was out, I carefully opened the drawer. I took a single, significant page from the notebook, a page detailing a particularly lavish weekend getaway with one of his long-term mistresses, and replaced it with a blank page. Then, I carefully placed a single, small, red rose petal on top of the remaining contents, a detail I knew would resonate with him from a specific, romantic text message I had seen on his phone. I relocked the drawer, leaving no trace of my intrusion. When he discovered it, the effect was immediate and devastating. He came home later that day, not agitated or paranoid, but utterly broken. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended mere fear. He stumbled into the living room, clutching the notebook, the single red petal still clinging to the page. "It's in my study," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Someone was in my study. They took a page. And this." He held up the petal, his hand trembling uncontrollably. I looked at him, my face a mask of concern, my heart pounding with a triumphant drumbeat. "What are you talking about, honey?" I asked, my voice soft, innocent. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading terror. And then, slowly, the dam broke. I think I'm losing my mind, he stammered, tears welling in his eyes. Or someone knows. Someone knows everything. He was on the verge of confession, pushed to the brink by the relentless psychological assault. This was the moment I had meticulously planned for, the culmination of weeks of silent suffering and cunning revenge. The final act was about to begin. The sight of him, utterly broken, clutching that notebook with the single red petal, was a potent cocktail of vindication and a strange, cold satisfaction. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. He wasn't just scared, he was completely unmoored, adrift in a sea of paranoia I had meticulously engineered. His eyes, once so skilled at deflection, now held a desperate plea, a nascent understanding that something far beyond his control was happening. Someone knows, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper, the words catching in his throat. They're in my head. They're everywhere. He looked around the room, as if expecting the walls themselves to reveal a hidden observer. The years of gaslighting, of making me question my own reality, were now being reflected back at him, amplified and distorted. He was experiencing the very psychological torment he had inflicted. I maintained my composure, my expression a perfect blend of concern and bewilderment. Honey, what are you talking about? Who knows what? My voice was calm, steady, a stark contrast to his frantic state. This unwavering innocence was crucial. It prevented him from turning his suspicion on me, keeping him convinced that the threat was external, unseen, and omnipresent. He began to ramble, disjointed phrases tumbling out, fragments of his secret life intertwining with his growing paranoia. The red dress, the coffee shop, the hotel, it's all in here, he gestured wildly at the notebook. Someone took a page. They know about everything. He was confessing, not to me directly, but to the invisible tormentor he believed was stalking him. He was admitting his guilt under the immense pressure of believing he was being psychologically unraveled by an unknown entity. This was the moment I had anticipated, the precise point of his psychological break. I let him stew in his terror for a few more agonizing moments, allowing the weight of his confession, however indirect, to settle in the air. Then, I subtly shifted my demeanor. My voice remained calm, but a subtle edge of seriousness crept in, just enough to signal a shift in the dynamic. Darling, I said, my voice soft but firm, I think you need to tell me what's really going on. You're scaring me. What secrets are you talking about? What is everything? He hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the notebook. The fear of his unknown stalker was warring with the fear of my discovery. The first fear won. He believed that confessing to me, the seemingly innocent victim, was his only way out, his only hope of escaping the relentless psychological torment. He thought I was his safe harbor, his only confidant in a world that had turned against him. And then, it came. A torrent of confessions, punctuated by sobs and desperate pleas for understanding. He started with the woman in the red dress, then moved on to the boutique hotel in Scottsdale, detailing the lavish weekend. He confessed to the multiple affairs, the lies, the elaborate alibis, the money spent, the emotional energy invested in his parallel lives. He laid bare the full extent of his betrayal, believing he was unburdening himself to his unsuspecting wife, hoping she would somehow help him make sense of the stalking that had driven him to the brink. The details were even more sordid and extensive than my meticulous investigations had revealed. There were women I hadn't even suspected, places I hadn't tracked. He described the thrill of the deception, the ego boost, the way he compartmentalized his life, convincing himself that I would never find out. He spoke of his arrogance, his belief in his own cleverness, his utter disregard for my feelings. Each word was a knife, twisting in the wound he had inflicted, but now, each twist was met with a cold, hard satisfaction. The emotional arc for me was now complete. The initial betrayal had ignited a quiet suffering. That suffering had transformed into a strategic determination. The determination had fueled the meticulous planning and cunning execution of his psychological payback. And now, the culmination. His unraveling, his desperate, unprompted confession, delivered under the crushing weight of his own manufactured paranoia. As he spoke, tears streaming down his face, begging for forgiveness from the universe, from whoever was stalking him. I felt a profound sense of catharsis. It wasn't the kind of catharsis that brought peace or reconciliation. It was a darker, more potent form, the triumph of cunning over cruelty, of strategic intelligence over arrogant deceit. He had stripped me of my dignity, and I had returned the favor, tenfold. When he finally finished, exhausted and emotionally raw, he looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Please," he whispered. "You have to believe me. Someone is doing this to me. I don't know who, I don't know why, but they're making me crazy. You're the only one who can help me." I met his gaze, and for the first time, I allowed a flicker of something other than concern to cross my face. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in my expression, a flash of cold, hard triumph. He wouldn't recognize it, not yet, but the moment was mine. He thought he had confessed to an innocent confidant. He had, in fact, confessed to the architect of his downfall. The game was over. The secret was mine, and it would be my lasting triumph.